Picture this. You're walking up to a flat rock, sitting right at the edge of a field in Derbyshire. Now, on its surface, there aren't any ancient runes or fancy carvings. It's just small, rough holes drilled directly into the stone. And they're actually still there today. You could literally put your fingers into them if you wanted to. But honestly, if you knew what those holes were used for back in the summer of 1666, you'd probably pull your hand back immediately. You see, those holes held vinegar, and that vinegar was used by people right in the middle of a horrific plague outbreak to disinfect their coins. They'd leave their money at the edge of their village to pay farmers for bread and grain at the absolute greatest possible distance. All right, let's dive right into this explainer, the left-behind human stories of this 1665 Great Plague. To really grasp what these people were living through, we actually have to start with the census. 17th century London was this completely cramped city of about 460,000 people. And get this, it had absolutely no real sewage system. Waste was just thrown directly into these narrow little streets, mixing with animal dung and rotting refuse. Travelers could literally smell the city, this awful compound of rot, smoke, and fish, miles before they even arrived. Now, add to that already overwhelming stench the highly specific, deeply horrifying smell of mass death in the summer of 1665. It was an absolute sensory nightmare, and that's before the dying even really peaked. And man, that peak was unimaginable. Just let this staggering number sit heavily with you for a second. 7,165. According to the city's weekly death registers, that is exactly how many people died of the plague in a single 7-day period during the week ending September 12, 1665. That basically equates to 1 in 65 Londoners dying in just 1 week. To put that into perspective, if you maintained that horrific rate for a year, the entire city would be completely empty in just 4 months. So when the numbers really started climbing, the city just kind of fractured in two. On one side, you had the Great Flight. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 elites just abandoned the city. King Charles II fled with his court. Nobles, lawyers, and even most of the city's physicians packed up and got out of there. But on the other side, you had the trapped. The Lord Mayor, a tiny handful of officials like Dr. Nathaniel Hodges, and overwhelmingly the poor. They were forced to stay behind in these crowded, rat-infested suburbs for one simple reason. They literally had nowhere else to go. And we actually have this incredible window into how the people who remained coped with the terror all around them. Take this quote from Samuel Pepys, a 32-year-old naval administrator and diarist. On September 7th, 1665, he jotted down that the weekly death toll was over 8,000, and then he just went to a dinner party. Seriously, and it wasn't because Pepys was some unfeeling monster. It's because the plague had been raging since April. The human mind just cannot sustain maximum panic at a constant rate forever. You adapt. You kind of normalize the catastrophe, and the horror eventually just fades into the background noise of the city. Now, Pepys and others were tracking those death tolls using something called the Bills of Mortality. Parish clerks collected the death numbers every Tuesday, and they were printed on Thursday mornings for the public to buy. Londoners read these exactly the way we all read pandemic infection dashboards not that long ago. People like Pepys tracked the weekly curves with this anxious obsession, while the rich, who were safely out in the countryside, bought them for a penny just to judge if it was safe to finally return. It was really England's first major attempt at systematic public health data. But that data revealed a pretty brutal truth. The deaths were not evenly distributed. Take Clerkenwell, for example. In May and June, they saw 64 burials. But by August and September, that number surged to 229. So the key takeaway here is that while the plague obviously had no biological preference, it absolutely devastated the poorest parishes. In places like Clerkenwell, St. Giles, and Whitechapel, the poor were packed into subdivided buildings with earthen floors. Rats literally nested in the very fabric of the rotting walls. Wealth bought distance for sure, but poverty bought exposure. And for those who were exposed, the official response was downright terrifying. It was known as quarantina, coming from the Italian word for 40. Basically, this was the official policy of shutting up a house. If just one person showed signs of the plague, the entire household, sick and healthy alike, was locked inside for 40 straight days after the last infected person died. They'd paint a red cross on the door with the desperate words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," and post a watchman outside so no one could escape. It was pretty much a brutal death sentence for the healthy family members trapped inside with their dying relatives. And what went on inside those locked houses was an absolute nightmare. We know this because it was meticulously recorded by Dr. Nathaniel Hodges. He was one of the very few trained doctors who bravely chose to stay in London. He actually visited these plague houses, relying on burning hot coals and drinking fortified wine to somehow protect himself. He recorded unseen horrors, this unquenchable inner thirst, blackness of the tongue, the hard, hot buboes swelling in the lymph nodes, and the dark hemorrhaging under the skin that actually gave the medieval Black Death its name. You had maybe a 30% chance of surviving the bubonic form, but if you caught the pneumonic form in the lungs, that was almost always fatal. Now, because absolutely no one in 1665 understood the bacterium Yersinia pestis, or that it was actually being spread by fleas riding on black rats, they relied on some pretty desperate superstitious measures. They basically believed the disease was caused by bad air. So they'd chew roll tobacco to supposedly purify their lungs, which is actually something Samuel Pepys did to calm his nerves when he was terrified after seeing his very first red crosses on doors. They carried sachets of lavender and rosemary pressed right up against their noses, and they even burned sulfur in the streets to clear out the invisible poison they thought was floating all around them. Moving on to Section 1, the ultimate sacrifice, the village of Eyam. So let's trace this timeline. The plague arrived in the Peak District village of Eyam in September 1665, accidentally carried inside a damp bundle of cloth ordered from London. People began dying really quickly. By the spring of 1666, the village's 32-year-old rector, William Mompesson, stepped up to lead. And he proposed something truly extraordinary, a voluntary quarantine. He actually convinced the villagers to seal themselves inside Eyam, refusing to let anyone leave to ensure the disease wouldn't spread further into the north of England. Mompesson even organized open-air sermons in a limestone dell just to keep people spread out. The tragedy finally peaked in August 1666, claiming even the rector's own 27-year-old wife, Catherine Mompesson. She had bravely refused to flee without him. The cost of this decision is it's almost unfathomable. Out of the roughly 350 people living in Eyam, between 250 and 260 died. At least 3/4 of their entire population was wiped out in just 14 months. But they stayed. They pressed their coins into those vinegar stones we talked about earlier to buy food from afar, and they held a boundary against a horrific disease they didn't even begin to understand. It was a line drawn at the absolute highest human cost imaginable. Which brings us to Section 2, the unexplained end. Why the plague stopped. Okay, I bet you've heard this popular myth. The Great Fire of London in September 1666 supposedly burned out the plague by destroying all the rat-infested buildings, right? Well, that is almost certainly wrong. The Great Fire primarily burns the wealthy inner walls of the old city, destroying around 13,200 buildings. But remember, the plague had mostly ravaged the poorest suburbs, like Whitechapel and Shoreditch, and the fire didn't even touch those areas. More importantly, the epidemic was already in a steep decline over 9 months before the fire even started. The plague was essentially already gone. So if the fire didn't end it, what actually did? Well, today, scientists are using modern tools to explore some fascinating theories. They're actually examining DNA extracted from 350-year-old teeth found during the recent Crossrail excavations at Liverpool Street. Some theories suggest the black rats developed a resistance, which reduced the number of infected fleas. Or maybe the human population itself built up partial immunity. We do know the bitter cold winters of 65 and 66 definitely helped kill off the fleas, and significantly stricter port quarantines stopped the disease from coming back in. It was likely a combination of all these factors, but historians and scientists are literally still listening to the silence of the ground to figure it out for sure. This disease, which had returned every single generation since 1348, killed 100,000 Londoners in 18 months, and then it just never came back. So we're left with the incredible legacy of the people who stayed behind. People like Dr. Nathaniel Hodges, who drank his fortified wine and saved the city, but wasn't saved by it. He sadly died in a debtor's prison at age 58. Or Catherine Mompesson, who died at just 27, holding a line to protect the North. As we mentally stand by those dry vinegar stones of Eyam today, the question we really have to ask ourselves is, how will we remember the immense price paid by the ordinary heroes who refused to flee?